Welcome everyone. Welcome to MAREA, the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association. MAREA is a 501c3 nonprofit grassroots organization made up of volunteers dedicated to educating and engaging the public in advocating for renewable energy production, energy efficiency, and sustainable living. We encourage you to listen, ask questions, experiment with what you learn, and help others to become more sustainable. I'm Phil Jones. I'm tonight's host, and tonight we are presenting Re-naturalizing to create a pollinator haven. Before we get started, we'd like to share our online renewable energy and sustainable living coming attractions live on the last Tuesday of each month. Next month, on July 27th, we present Offshore Wind Blowing Our Way. Wind is one of the most important means to becoming carbon neutral. We have lots of wind generation in the Midwest and West, but what about the heavily populated industrial Eastern U.S.? Learn firsthand about the Atlantic Shores Offshore's wind project and their efforts to build a 3 gigawatt of clean energy off the coast of New Jersey. Doug Copeland, Atlantic Shores Development Manager, will present the benefits of offshore wind, the 35 studies completed for their first federal construction and operations filing, ongoing studies, what's involved in choosing a particular technology, and Atlantic Shores' overall plan to build and operate this offshore wind project. So I hope you'll join us then for that. And then on Tuesday, October 31st, we move on to electric vehicle charging infrastructure. While we've searched for that cool, affordable electric vehicle, how are we going to keep it charged at home, at work, shopping, and also for those road trips? Join us to learn what charging infrastructure is needed and what is being done to enable and install the infrastructure so that you can refuel your electrons where and when you need them. And join Tom Bonner from the front lines, who's bringing a charging station to a corner near you. Then in September, just recently, Jeff Tester committed to do the September talk. He's the professor of sustainable energy systems at Cornell University, and he will take us on a deep dive into small scale, medium scale, and really big scale geothermal or earth source heat to heat your home, cities, and even to generate electricity as the critical dispatchable source of renewable energy we need for a sustainable future. Dr. Tester will share his project to heat the entire Cornell campus with deep geothermal. But now to tonight's program. And before we get started, I wanted for you to please note that during the presentation, your mics will be muted, but you can enter questions into the chat box. Please address your chat to everyone. If you want to be sure your question will be addressed at the end. At the end of the presentation, we will ask your chat questions, and with any remaining time, you are welcome to ask your additional questions directly using the hand emoji. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and available in a few days on our website. And now, Bill Hennessy, the first in our group to discover tonight's wonderful speaker, will introduce tonight's featured presenter, Karen Campbell.
Okay, I'll just really briefly we saw Karen give a talk to the Audubon Society through the Lehigh Valley Abdomen Society, I call it, earlier this year. She's a fantastic photographer, and her project is truly aspirational. And I'd like to introduce her with leave it at that, and re-naturalizing to create a pollinator heaven. Go ahead, Karen.
All right. Let me do my screen share here. And hopefully this time it will go full screen easier. Yeah, it's going to be ornery just like last time. There we go. All right. Our renaturalization is the 22-year transformation of a 4-acre fallow agricultural field and woodland fragments around it to a natural ecosystem. This property is also our home, and it's located in rural residence, those of you that aren't specifically in this area. The concept of renaturalizing requires bringing native plants back, but doing so in a way that also reestablishes interaction between native plants and the wildlife that co-evolved with it. because they really need each other for survival. And that's part of what I hope you get out of my presentation tonight. I'm also going to share our discovery of the pollinators that have returned to our property and live in this pollen haven that we've created. Learning about pollinators is a great way to observe nature, and it informs restoration needs. Luckily, pollinators are easy to observe on flowers, and you can find them on lovely days. While I'm going to stick to pollinators tonight, I could have just as easily shown you a haven for birds, dragonflies, or all manners of other wildlife. That's because they all go together. Renaturalizing includes wildlife that we may not target, but is part of the ecosystem. So as an outline for tonight's presentation, I'm going to start by showing you who some of the pollinators are that have made it to our property so that you can get a feel for the diversity of the insects that we call pollinators. Then I'm going to cover what plants need and what pollinators need. And this helps inform considerations in order to create a successful ecosystem. Then I'm going to get back to our property to show what the steps are that we took to bring nature back to health. I'm going to cover the 3 distinct areas of our yard: the meadow, the woodlands area, and the gardens and the pond that are around our house. And so right here you're seeing the pond, which is behind our house. We were a totally dry property before we put this in. Lastly, I'm going to end on me and my transformation. Renaturalizing our property was as much about me changing my expectations about landscaping and even my relationship with nature. So this is how you're likely to see me out in the yard when I'm out shooting with the camera. And all of the photos in this presentation, so you know, are all taken on our property. Our yards and local natural areas have some truly amazing and crazy looking wildlife, but most of it is really small. So to find this wildlife, we need to look closely and differently. Not like if you're looking for a mammal like a giraffe or something. You're looking at a very different scale. So many of the images in this presentation are what's called macro photography. And what that means is that what you're seeing is much bigger than life size. So the actual size of many of these subjects are only about 1 inch across, and some of the insects are only about 1/4 inch in size. I also want you to meet my husband, Gary. He's the other part of whenever I'm talking about we or us or our. Gary's a landscape designer and a horticulturist, and he's basically responsible for the design, execution, and most of the ongoing land stewardship of our landscape. He also took some of the photos that you're going to see. Unfortunately, he's tied up in another meeting tonight that's in person, not here at home, so he's not going to be able to join us. So my goal when we started this project was to create a pollinator haven. So let's start with what that is. Some people will answer that it's a garden with nectar plants for bees and butterflies. Others add to that and basically say, well, it needs to include native plants. I'd say both of those are correct, but they're incomplete to actually call it a haven. At a house that we lived in prior to this one, we cut out part of our lawn and we created a pollinator garden by adding some native plants to our otherwise traditionally landscaped property. It did attract pollinators, and while that was a huge benefit and improvement over just having our lawn, and pollinators did come and visit it, that's not what I'm talking about, as a haven. Creating a haven also requires developing a sustainable habitat. And that's where pollinators can live and feed. So it's beyond just the nectar plants. And the plants themselves create communities with each other. So let's take a walk through the pollinators. Bees provide the largest portion of our native plant pollinator services and are considered to be our most efficient pollinators. You can see in this one the electrostatic hairs that attract pollen, and those then easily allow them to carry pollen between flowers which they incidentally then end up using to complete cross-pollination. Female bees have pollen sacs on their legs or other ways to carry pollen to their nests. Now they're carrying pollen because that's what bee larvae feed on. This bumblebee has sacs full of a bright orange pollen. And so that's what you're seeing there. That blob on its leg is all pollen. This metallic bee is a sweat bee. And it's with a shining flower beetle on an aster. On a hot day, sweat bees really earn their name because they will land on your arm or your leg, and they actually kind of suck on you to suck the perspiration a little bit. They're a nuisance. It's not a bite. It's just bothersome. So to give you an idea of the diversity of bees, there have been, the number that I saw was 437 species of bees that have been recorded in Pennsylvania. And some of our surrounding states have similar numbers of bee species. However, most bee species can't be identified to species by a photo. So unfortunately, that's not one of the insects that I've been able to get a really good count on that have made it to our property. So butterflies, though, as pollinators, man, they get all the love. On Instagram, I post a butterfly, like. Anyway, for all the beautiful colors, but despite that, they really aren't very effective pollinators. Butterflies don't have hair. Instead, they have scales, and pollen doesn't attach very well to the scales. So the reason why they really are pollinators is because that pollen tends to accumulate on their tongues and their legs. It's not a lot, but they take so many trips and such frequent trips to flowers that they end up pollinating just by virtue of all their trips. Some butterflies, though, do actually end up carrying some along on the head and their underside of their wings. There are many more types of pollinators, though, other than bees and butterflies, that don't get much attention. This is a flower fly. They're also known as syrphids or hoverflies, and they've got a really special place for me. Because when we started, remember I said that I wanted to do a pollinator haven, and I was still in that same category of thinking it was all about bees. So I was taking photos of things like this, actually thinking that I was taking pictures of bees, but this is a fly. It's one of the syrphid flies, or flower flies as they're known. The flower flies are now believed to be responsible for about 1/3 of all of our pollinator services. This one here is called the drone fly, and it's actually a good imitator of the honeybee, neither of which, by the way, are native. This family is fantastic mimics of all manner of bees and flies. This one actually resembles a wasp called the bald-faced hornet, which is that species that builds the big paper nests that you see up in trees. These flies are totally harmless, but some of them make some really menacing wasp-like sounds. In fact, I think that it took me way too many years to discover them because I thought they were wasps and I tried to stay away from them. Notice on this one, its front legs are black and it's holding them in front of its head. It's actually holding them as if to make them look like they're the longer antenna that a wasp would have. Did you know that moths don't just fly at night? Some species are daytime flyers, and this hummingbird clearwing, which is on bee balm or Monarda, often gets mistaken as a hummingbird, but it's a moth. Moths, just like their butterfly cousins, they're all Lepidoptera, are nectar feeders, and they have no interest in pollen. It's their long tongues, also called proboscises, that get them to that nectar within the flower. The diversity and beauty of moths that now live and visit our property has been one of our truly biggest surprises. We've now recorded almost 700 unique species on our property, and we still have many photos of unidentified moths that I think probably take it quite a bit over that. Wasps obviously related to bees, are primarily carnivores, but some of them are pollinators, and some of them just supplement their carnal feedings by visiting flowers for nectar. This is one called a threadwaist wasp, also called a great golden digger wasp. A few of the wasps are quite hairy, like their bee cousins, and they can be quite effective pollinators. This is one called a two-spotted scoliid wasp, and it's just one of the big showy wasps in our area that you can sometimes find on flowers. And the last group of insects is beetles. They aren't normally noted as being pollinators, but beetles are actually the biggest wildlife family of pollinators in the world. Characteristic of all beetles, just by virtue of the fact that they're a beetle, is that they only have chewing mouth parts. They can't suck. So what that means is they eat pollen. And on occasion, some of them get a little carried away and eat the whole flower, which of course defeats the purpose of pollinating, but that's just what they do. This is a red milkweed beetle, and it is one of the many insects that is a milkweed specialist. These are longhorn flower beetles, and they're very common in our area here. These are feeding on swamp magnolia. Long before bees existed, beetles co-evolved with the very earliest flowering plants, and plants in the magnolia family are one of those earliest flowering plants that evolved. So to ensure their success, they already know the beetles are going to eat up a bunch of their pollen, so they just produce lots of extra pollen. So even today, there are flower species that remain totally dependent on beetles for pollination. And this swamp magnolia is pretty much one of them. So now that you have a feel for the pollinators that I have showing up in my yard, and actually any place, let's get into the needs of plants and pollinators that are important to be able to create a sustainable ecosystem. Pollination is actually as much about the plant as the pollinator. This is a mass of winterberry holly plants that are in bloom. In bloom, flowers with over 100 pollinators on them. See the flowers of the pollinators? I can't. Plants aren't creating flowers for our viewing pleasure. It actually takes a lot of energy for plants to create flowers. So the goal of the plant is actually to attract the specific pollinators that will provide its services. Like all living beings, the goal of a plant is to reproduce. But because it can't move, plants have a different challenge than most living beings and has to rely on others for that service. So plants need to be fertilized to create their seed, and this is the winterberry holly seed. They also tend to rely on wildlife for seed dispersal in addition to the pollination services. I just had to have a way to bring another bird into the photo. This is basically the flower of the winterberry holly. So the challenge to fertilization is that pollen needs to be transported from the male part of a flower, which is called the anther, to the female part, which is the pistil. About 70% of all of our plants utilize pollinators in order to fertilize their flowers. So the plant provides the nectar, which is a carbohydrate, in order to attract those pollinators as their reward for providing the pollinator services. Most of the pollinators are insects, but as we know, there are some birds like hummingbirds and bat species that are also pollinators. This, by the way, is a bee called a cuckoo bee. The transfer of pollen then itself is actually incidental. These insects don't have any idea what they're actually doing for the plant. They just know that they get nectar in exchange for being on the flower. Many plants require pollen to be transferred between flowers actually on different plants. but some can be pollinated on a single plant or even on a flower. In the case of winterberry holly, there are actually completely separate male and female plants. So for us to renaturalize using hollies, we need to make sure that we're planting both male and female plants, or otherwise we won't be able to actually have berries produced. So unfortunately for this plant, and for plants in general, many of the insects that visit a plant don't actually pollinate it, and for that matter, aren't even capable of pollinating it. So on this Monarda, only the bumblebee, which is the one on the upper left, is probably capable of actually pollinating the plant. The other ones are too small. Some plants have developed traits in order to attract only the insects that will pollinate them and then exclude the ones that aren't. This one happens to be pretty open and attract a broad range of pollinators. So how do the plants do that? Size, shape, and color are just some of those traits that plants use. So this is a cardinal flower. It has very long nectary tubes that restrict all but the longest tongue pollinators from sipping its nectar. Red is a color that's highly attractive to hummingbirds, and hummingbirds are one of its primary pollinators. But bees don't actually see red. So let's see, hopefully you can see this. This is actually the nectary, and the nectar itself is all the way down here. Oops. All the way down here at the bottom. So this butterfly's tongue is actually going all the way down into it. So occasionally there's tiny insects like this flower fly that may come to eat the pollen, but they're unlikely to actually pollinate the flower. So bees don't see red, but they see blue. So it's no surprise that the related plant, which is called the great blue lobelia, its key pollinators are bees. So the flower actually provides a landing pad for bees to be able to sit on, and then it has color variation that help the bees actually be able to find where the nectar is stored within the plant. Beetles are really poor flyers, and they need even larger landing pads. So this is hydrangea, and hydrangea flowers tend to be one of the plants that the longhorn beetles really spend a lot of time on pollinating. Some plants take further steps in order to discourage the undesired insects. This is penstemon, also called beard tongue, and it, as well as some other plants, mountain laurel's one that I've seen lately that comes to mind, they produce a sticky substance that's on or around the flower. And this is actually believed that it helps keep ants and other wildlife that would walk on the plant from stealing the nectar. There's a lot of nectar thieves out there, and ants are one of them. This is Baptisia, also called wild indigo. It hides its nectar and pollen inside a tight clasping flower that requires an insect that's strong enough and big enough to actually open up the flower. Bumblebees are some of its key pollinators. So is this megachile bee. They're the leaf cutters and the mason bees, and they can be identified by having pollen brushes underneath their abdomen. Notice that while this bee is sucking down the nectar with its head, into the flower itself, which it's pulled open, that it is actually transferring pollen from underneath its abdomen with the plant without even knowing what it's doing. Some plants only make pollen available at certain times of day. This little flower is called the blue-eyed grass. It's actually really an iris, and its flowers only open for a single day. And it actually only opens flowers on days when the weather is right for its pollinators. Rainy day, cold day, they stay clamped. It opens up on nice days. Many flowers remain open at night and attract a wide variety of night-flying moths. And this is a mass of summer sweet that's a shrub that we have outside our front door that when we have the front porch lights on, we occasionally find moths pollinating on. So while most plants release pollen passively, meaning it's just always there as long as the plant's open, about 8% of our flowering plants have something called a closed anther, and it requires a special technique for release of the pollen. It's really stingy. So this is actually known as something called buzz pollination. Bumblebees are one of our most important buzz pollinators. The flower here is one called senna. Other flowers that require buzz pollinators include rhododendrons and azaleas and blueberries and cranberries. So this is a bee on a blueberry flower. What the bee does is it holds onto the anther, which in this case it's doing with its mouth. You can't really see it. It's up into the flower, right in there. And it uses a high frequency vibration that causes the pollen grains in the anther to bounce up and down, gain so much energy until they actually blast out. So the bee in the picture here was just blasted in the face with pollen from the blueberry. That's why there's pollen all over its face. Some of our crop plants, notably tomatoes and potatoes, actually require this kind of pollination. About half of our bee species are capable of buzz pollinating. Interestingly, honeybees cannot. Excuse me. So, plants expect fidelity from their pollinating wildlife. Many pollinators only feed on one species of plant, sometimes for their entire life, or at least for days at a time, as long as plants are available. Leaving pollen on the wrong plant is actually failure for the plant. It's not going to be fertilized. So what you see here is an andrenid bee that's on a flower. So its pollen sacs have the pollen from this flower, but on its back, notice that it's like a yellow, yellow or orange pollen. It's from a different plant. So when we're renaturalizing a space, we need to include multiple plants of the same species. This supports the plant's ability to reproduce, and it attracts the pollinators that are showing the plant fidelity. Insects that feed so in this scene, the blue flower there is Jacob's ladder. The insects that come and feed on Jacob's ladder do not stop on the red and yellow columbine and vice versa. So it's really important to make sure that you've got plenty of each of the plant species. So despite the fact that some plants are really picky, there are plenty that are just open for business for any of the pollinators that want to show up. This is mountain mint. I was showing this in some of the video up front that had hordes of pollinators on it. It's a generalist plant and it attracts a wide range of pollinators. Many of those pollinators themselves are quite generalist. So that's the plant. Next, I'm going to go into what pollinators need. So most pollinators are insects in their adult phase of life. The adult phase for insects is actually relatively short compared to the other phases, which are egg, larva, and pupa. This is a black swallowtail chrysalis, and this is how it overwintered on our fence post. So to support a sustainable population of adult pollinators, we must support the other life phases. That includes accepting plant eaters like the larvae of butterflies and moths. While some of them are generalists and will use a broad range of woody and herbaceous plants, many are specialists whose larvae require specific plant species to feed on. Of course, the most celebrated is the relationship of the monarch butterfly and thus its larva with the milkweed family. There are estimated 770-ish species of bees in the eastern U.S. About a quarter of them are specialists of plants, specifically because their larvae have evolved to only be able to feed on specific types of pollen. This is another megachile, and it is a specialist on ironweed. Many bees in the Andrenidae family of bees are specialized to a single plant for survival. This is golden Alexander's. It's one example, but the Andrenids, different species, specialize on a wide range of native plants, particularly some in the spring. They tend to be our earliest bees that come out in the spring. So examples are the spring beauties and bloodroot, and even many of our tree species like willow and dogwood. So before I go to the next photo, take a look at its back, because that's the next one here. So bee larvae need nesting and feeding locations. Many of our native bees nest in the ground, and most of these are solitary nesters. These are our mining and digging bees. So that mud on the back of it is basically because it was, pretty wet out, and that's a female who's been taking pollen back and forth to prepare her eggs with little balls of. All right, can you hear me again? Good?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. All right, so she's taking pollen back to the nest, and occasionally I see them with some mud caked on them. When you see circle cutouts like this in leaves, you know that you've got a megachile leaf cutter in your yard. Here's one that has a rolled up leaf that she's actually taking into a nest that's underneath our deck rail. Megachiles, which also include the mason bees, nest in pre-existing cavities. Some adult bees also overwinter in hollow twigs, or they excavate twigs to lay their eggs. I saw this, but unfortunately I never saw what kind of bee it was specifically that made the hole in that twig. Bumblebees are one of our native colony nesting bees, and they're actually a woodland species. Only the queen bee overwinters, and she emerges in the spring. She's in massive search for food and starts to search through woodland floors, particularly those that are leaf covered, in order to find a location for a nest and to start a new colony. So one of the other ways that pollinators' larvae exist are as predators. So this is an example. Some of the flower flies have predatory larvae. In the lower left, you'll see a little green wormy-like looking thing. That's actually the larva of a flower fly, and it is at high rates sucking up aphids. These are great aphid eaters, but it's a really good reason not to spray any kind of pesticides on your plants to kill aphids, because if you do, you're actually also likely killing flower fly pollinators. So the adults themselves do need continuous bloom during their adult life. So when we select plants, we intentionally spread out bloom time so that we've got something blooming at all times. So if I go back to the monarch example, milkweeds actually bloom in June and July, but that's actually before most of the adults are even in our area. So to support monarchs, aside from planting milkweeds, it's critically important that we make sure we're planting nectar sources that support the adults all the way through and including when they're doing their migration in September and October. All right, so now you've had the highlight of pollinators and plants and what their needs are. Now I'm going to get a little bit into our property and what the actual process was for renaturalization. So this is essentially a before picture, and as you can see, it looks pretty ugly. We purchased our 4-acre property in 1999, and we had, despite the fact that it looked like this, we had a vision and we had priorities. So my goal really was for a native plant habitat for birds and pollinators. Gary had a more complete picture of our undertaking because he obviously had the education, training, and experience through his business, but he wanted personal experience in actual doing. So this is the current aerial of Google aerial. I'll give the Google their credit of our property. And I'm going to split it into 3 parts. I'm going to go over the meadow itself, then the garden and pond area, which is around the house in the center, and the woodland areas that are the surrounding spaces. So dealing with the expansive fallow agricultural field was our first priority. This is the part that became our meadow. First of all, we killed the noxious weeds, and then we seeded that entire area with a custom mix that Gary designed for our site and the specific site needs. The meadow includes approximately 65 different species of plants. They were planted in different zones, and some of the species were even hand sown in order to create different kinds of drifts throughout the meadow to look more natural. Meadows take several years to develop and mature. So this is a picture from the first year of our meadow. As is typical, it was dominated with annuals and short-lived perennials. Most of those white flowers you see are actually volunteers. They were volunteer native fleabanes that came up. We were really happy to know that we had so much of a native seed somehow laying dormant in the field. Gary also designed paths through the meadow that he regularly mows. We thought the paths were for us, but it's been a surprise to find out how important they are for the wildlife. Dragonflies, like this one here on the stick, robber flies, and other predatory insects actually use the paths for hunting, and some of the larger animals like deer, fox, and turkeys use them too. The character and mix of plants in a meadow are constantly changing by time of year, even between years, and even based on weather and what time of year we get rains. It'll change the height of the meadow that year and whatever the deer decide to munch one year. So this is what it looks like in April after it's been mowed, just as it's starting to come to life. In May, it's about knee high, and we really only have one major plant blooming. That's the golden alexanders, Rosizia. This was basically what it looks like now. The blue flower in the background is Tradescantia, and of course the one in the front is common milkweed. So not a lot of different types of plants blooming, but they're just starting to get going. And now as we'll be moving into July, it basically explodes. And then for the rest of the summer, it'll just be an ongoing series of different species of plants that start flowering and transitioning through. So this is into August, and in August, the warm season grasses really start to bloom and flower. This is getting into September. All of these were taken from our deck, so they're kind of down overlooking the meadow. When you actually get down and get your eyes right on it, you see a very different level of detail than you would from above. So this is the bloom of asters that we have, particularly for migrating butterflies in September and other more the late season pollinators. That's also when some of the earlier flowering plants are already starting to go to seed, which is really important for many of the birds that we feed in the field. We had pretty much hundreds of goldfinches every year, but this year they were joined by the pine siskins that erupted through the area. Some of you may be aware of that. And the sparrows, when they come in and spend the fall and winter. So we go into dormancy come around October, and the meadow provides shelter for a lot of wildlife in addition to its seed value. When we get snows, it essentially packs down some of that dormant growth and provides protective cover for many of the mammals and insects and even birds. So we hire one of the local farmers to mow the meadow annually each spring. Gary marks off any volunteer trees he wants to let grow to create structure in the meadow. Over time, we've reduced the amount of space the amount of the meadow that we mow, and I'll cover that in a little bit because we're actually reestablishing some woodland area that originally started as meadow. The primary maintenance of our meadow is vigilance and removal of invasive plants, invasive non-natives primarily, but from the beginning, control of the invasive plants has had to be one of our top prioritized maintenance requirements. New challenges that have crept in include this plant, which is a dying bittersweet. Plants that weren't around when we got started include stiltgrass, mugwort, crown vetch, and mileminute, just to name a few. We also choose to hold back some of the more aggressive native plants in order to help maintain and encourage the diversity level that we have. So some of the plants that we hold back a little bit are Canada thistle, the Canada and tall goldenrod, although you wouldn't know it because the meadow's full of it, grape, and poison ivy. So now I'm going to move on to the garden and the planting areas around the house. Our renaturalization was such a large-scale project to be completed in many different parts that really a vision was not enough. We needed a plan. So with my input, Gary created a design, and that became our guide basically for all of the work to complete all of the garden and patio areas. This right here is just showing part of it. It's just the courtyard and pond area. So this was the front of our house post-construction. Hardscaping has to come first. So that, in this case, was a retaining wall and walkways. And that was really all we accomplished in the first year. In year 2, we planted the gardens in the front of the house. So we started by planting the trees and shrubs. So those are the woodies. They provide the structure for a landscape. They're also the ones that take the longest time to reach maturity. So they usually need to be planted before the smaller perennials because you're likely to hurt or even destroy them as you plant the woodies. So in order, woodies and then the perennials. So once we had the woodies in the ground, we were able to plant the herbaceous perennials. This photo is at the end of that first year when we finally got them all in the ground in the front of the house. Because our garden area covered such a large area and our native soil was just so full of rocks that didn't make it very diggable, we mostly planted with restoration-sized plugs and smaller container plants. No, not really any big potted plants at all. So this is what the front of our house looks like now. As the woody plants grew to maturity, some of our initial sun-loving plants died out. Others thrived, or we even had some volunteers move in. This is it from the other side. You can actually see the retaining wall here. We've made many modifications to the herbaceous plants in this bed over the years, and that's primarily because as these woody plants matured and now have become large trees, they've essentially changed the whole nature of the requirements for the herbaceous plants that are now more of a shaded understory. So that was something I hadn't realized was going to end up happening when we got started. This is the area, basically the courtyard area. We left the courtyard, pond, and patio until the 3rd year. And this is the view that we saw out our kitchen window post-construction. The pond required heavy equipment in order to dig and move the rocks. So this was the first thing we put in. Notice that many of the plants are sitting in pots. The pond itself is a planted ecosystem. We created several shallow planting pockets along the edges where the plants got planted directly into the pockets. And then many of the larger plants, like water lilies, were sunk in pots in the deeper section. This is a photo of the pond in the patio gardens the first spring after they were constructed and planted. As you can see, there was a lot of rocks, extensive hardscaping and patio. Now I'm going to jump to today, and you will see that that's basically just been all swallowed up. Now that the plants have reached maturity, you don't really see many of those rocks or retaining, and even the pond in the left is pretty much covered in vegetation. This is an image of the pond as it looked at about 10 years in. At this point, some of the plants had spilled out of their pots, and there was some self-seeding in the bottom of the pond. But this is what it looked like this spring. We no longer have any pots. Everything is basically growing into the bottom of the pond at this point. This now supports a significant amount of aquatic wildlife that we really never would have believed was going to end up on our property or would have been here without the pond. And so that includes things like damselflies and dragonflies, frogs, and we even host an annual toad mating in every spring. In the subsequent years, we completed the rest of the plan. Now, at this point then, as we started to plant new areas, what we would typically do was divide plants from perennials from some of the other beds that we had previously planted. So we were essentially growing our own plants that we then used for some of the new areas. We also relocated a few plants that we just realized weren't quite happy where we'd originally put them. So sometime around year 5, we finally declared the garden's done. Now the wooded area. So this is a little modified from what I showed you before. The light blue areas are the shared woodlands that we have with neighbors. And the red areas are the locations where we're working on expanding those woods. For reference, the woods that are on the bottom part of this photo that have the deer fence in it, I'm going to refer to those as the front woods. And it actually borders on the street. So this is a current image of our front woods. Unlike the meadow and gardens, where basically we were starting with bare soil, here the woodlands started with mature trees, and they were largely native plants. So the big problem we had in the woods was that the understory layer of shrubs and the herbaceous plants were not only non-natives, but most of them were highly invasive species of those. So our restoration approach here was one of exclusion. So that basically means you remove the bad actors and you encourage new growth and regeneration of the desired plants that you want to have. So Gary started by removing basically an impenetrable layer of shrubs, which was largely honeysuckle, but also privet, multiflora rose were the main ones, other ones thrown in too though. He also cut out thick vines of poison ivy that were strangling most of the trees and blanketing the ground. And yes, poison ivy is a native plant, but it was just totally out of balance. This was not a single year activity. He did a little bit each year. He'd work in sections. The next year he'd expand a little bit more. Every year he basically, and even now, has to go back and revisit those early areas in order to make sure that any regrowth is killed off or any new invasive seedlings are killed as well. So in its place, we now have a shrub layer of native spicebush and black haw viburnum. And these all came back on their own. And understory trees that have regenerated include sassafras, hackberry, and pagoda dogwoods. Pagoda dogwoods love our property. We're also getting increased diversity of native canopy trees. That includes sugar maples, red oaks, black walnuts, and some tulip poplars, which is good because our front woods were predominantly black locusts, which were pretty much a colonial mass of them. So this is a fabulous to get some diversity of the tree species in the woodlands. The addition of the deer fence to reduce mammal grazing has been a key contributing factor to our understory layer recovery. Within the woods, the fence is largely invisible. Gary also works regularly on herbaceous understory invaders like garlic mustard. So the understory is now dominated by native plants that started on their own. They are also some great pollinators when each of them are blooming. So in the spring, anise fruit's the major attraction. We're also getting an increased amount of Solomon seal and false Solomon seal in our upper woods, front woods. And there are also a few historic May apples and bloodroots on the edge of our lower woods. In the summer, we have expanding areas of jump seed and white avens that have shown up. And in the fall, the woodlands actually pretty much blanket white with white snakeroot and wood aster drifts that get quite a few of the late season pollinators. So what you're seeing here, there's a little path through, but this is the portion of the meadow that we stopped mowing about 10 years ago. We're working to expand the woodlands with two different methods. So on this end where we stop mowing the meadow, we're basically letting it naturally regenerate. Have to give it a lot of help, but it's really working on its own. At that end, we've got a woodland corridor that really was kind of too narrow in order to be able to provide the right kind of wildlife value to be considered a corridor. So this expansion of it is to actually help improve that. We also realized pretty early on that it wasn't regenerating naturally. And then once we got socked with Hurricane Sandy, which took down about a dozen of our mature trees, and the recently arrived emerald ash borers that further reinforced the need for stewardship. So this is looking kind of into that same area from another direction. All the trees you see here have all been regenerated within the last 10 years. The sad thing about this is that about half of them are ashes, and we have been invaded with ash borers. So about half of these trees that we've already worked on are going to be dead within a few years. So we're working on obviously encouraging more of others. So the woods in the front of the house, our front woods, in order to expand there, we basically planted, just like we planted the garden. So here we increased the diversity of the plants with a wide range of woody plant species. We put in many different native rhododendrons, silver bell, red buds, a couple of different viburnums, bottlebrush buckeye, and a couple different hydrangeas. So many of these species have now grown to maturity, and they self-sow, which is just further helping improve the area. We also use some restoration plugs to help with the understory plants. But I gotta say that if we did not have these plants within the deer fence area for protection, very few of them probably would have survived. Of all the plants that we've added, our legacy white oak may be the most important single plant we've added for wildlife. We already had red oak species on the property, but there were no white oak species. So, but that's really a long-term view. This tree was a 6-foot tall lollipop when we planted it in 2002, and it looked that way for quite a few years. We were really wondering if it was going to ever grow, but this photo here was taken in fall of 2018. So now it's in its 20th year since planting, and this is the first year it's ever set flowers. So we're hopefully optimistic that because it's an open grown tree, maybe it'll set nuts soon. But it wouldn't be uncommon for a white oak to actually take several decades more before it produces its first fruit. Fruit. So the last portion of this presentation that I really want to go over, and it highlights some of the challenges of all of this, is the part about me and the changes that I've had to make with the property. So I learned traditional landscaping from my parents. That included planting annuals like impatiens around hostas, leaving lots of space around plants so they could all be mulched to look perfect. Trimming shrubs so that they would remain the same size each year, and of course mowing lawn. Anything outside of that monoculture was considered a weed and removed. I even manually, I think I was forced because I don't think I did it because I wanted to, remove dandelions from their front lawn. Natural landscaping compared to gardening requires me to let go of that perfect English garden look. So instead, our garden requires stewardship to help our landscape to be more sustainable, not to control it. If we use traditional, if Gary and I use traditional gardening techniques on our property, I don't think we'd ever have time to sleep. And that is not what we do, and we don't slave to this property. We're using different techniques. So as an example, this photo I'm showing, this is the look that I wanted for an area. This photo was taken in 2010 after we redid it a second time because it wasn't holding the first time. And I would spend hours and hours meticulously weeding plants out of this area to try to keep it looking nice. Well, I gave up. And I'm so glad I did. This area really, really wants to grow penstemon, and it just does it, and it takes over. It has this fabulous bloom that bumblebees just love and bounce around on. Once it's done flowering, I trim it down, and it just makes a lovely ground cover for the rest of the summer. And my hours of maintenance have just totally gone away. Fall cleanup is another big change from traditional landscaping. I was taught that in the fall, you rake leaves, you tidy up, you haul the debris off, and you're done. And everything's just, cleaned down to the lawn for the winter. Now I know that the overwintering phase of our insects are inner protected by that plant material. So I don't want to be throwing out next year's pollinators. So what I've learned to do is to wait until spring and let much of that plant material mulch in place. So while this bed doesn't have the clean, crisp look of mulch, it's pretty much going to be covered with plants in a couple of weeks anyhow, because this is probably in April, really by about the second week of May, those perennials will have come up and will be covering the ground. Natural weeding or natural landscapes still need weeding, even our pond. The hard part about weeding for many people is that what you're weeding is good plants. It's lovely native plants, and you end up pulling them out and throwing them on the mulch pile. That took me a while to get to. I've also learned that I have to let plants that I don't know grow first. Things that I think might be weeds, let them grow until hopefully they flower, because usually by the time they flower, that's when it's easier to identify them. And then I know what they are. If they're undesirable, then I can get rid of them. If not, we keep them. So this photo is of a jump seed. It's a plant that we never planted in our yard, but it is now one of the major components within our woodlands and many of our shaded gardens. And it's actually a very beautiful plant, both the foliage and these are really teeny little flowers though. This is a bed straw in our front bed that's poking up. It's a native, but I don't think it's a very attractive a plant, and I don't necessarily want it in the front of my yard. However, it is growing at the base of some fall sunflower plants that get aphids every year. And I used to pull this plant out every year until I really figured out that That's a flower fly feeding on it, and that is the fly that lays the eggs for the larvae that eat the aphids. So by leaving this plant in the ground, at least while it's flowering, I'm encouraging more of the insects that are going to lay the eggs and help get rid of my aphids naturally. Many of you will know this plant. This is garlic mustard. When we started, we were both against using chemicals on our property. However, we quickly witnessed how fast, and I mean really fast, invasive non-native plants can just totally destroy a natural ecosystem. In some cases, some of them even prevented us from being able to establish native plants in the first place. We've tried various approaches to natural treatments over the years, and some of these plants just laugh right back at us. This is garlic mustard in our woodlands as an example. This photo was taken from this spring, and it's a plant that Gary's actually worked on since we've been on the property. Yet here it is, crowding out good plants in an area and rapidly spreading. So ultimately, our choice was pretty simple. It took us a little bit to get to it, but unless we really wanted our property to be overtaken by invasive plants, we felt we had to learn how to responsibly use some selective chemicals in a manner in order to minimize risks, but yet control what we absolutely needed to. We still use mostly natural control methods where we can, but we also use chemicals where it's needed. This is my example from before. To kill this oriental bittersweet, Gary simply dripped the leaves with an herbicide from a drip bottle. So it did nothing other than just touch the leaves of this plant and didn't affect anything around it. It's very similar to a method called cut and paint. And there you basically apply an herbicide to a cut stem of a plant and just let the plant actually suck the herbicide right up into the plant. As a land steward, I've also learned to accept the web of life, even though at times it's gruesome and as scary as a Hollywood movie. This is a giant robber fly it'll snatch a butterfly just completely out of mid-flight. I used to be terrified of spiders, and that is not macro photography. That is one giant spider web, by the way. But yet spiders are so critically important to a sustainable ecosystem. They do prey on pollinators, but I now better appreciate that our native insects, including spiders, are really just fulfilling their life cycle. I also find them much more fascinating to watch now. For plant lovers, letting insects eat plants is actually maybe one of the harder changes. Not only are some caterpillars our future adult pollinators, but they're also an important food source for birds and other wildlife. These were on one of our cherry trees. When we first started planting, our yard was terribly out of balance, and because it was just basically not a properly functioning ecosystem. We thought grasshoppers were going to absolutely destroy everything that we planted. It took some patience, but the next year after our first major chomp of major grasshoppers, birds showed up early in the spring, and they basically just crawled over the bed and ended up eating most of the early stage grasshoppers. We haven't had that problem again ever since. I started with an understanding that some invasive insects can be destructive to plants. Most of you will be familiar with Japanese beetles. But what I really had no idea of was the impact that some of them, our non-native insects, have to native insect species. On our property, praying mantids are one of the worst problems. They're different from other predators because they didn't co-evolve in our ecosystem, and they can totally dominate it. So to help control mantids, we've started collecting and destroying their egg cases over the winter. The last change I'll note is that I've developed a healthier relationship with nature. And I appreciate now that I am a part of nature. Now I walk through it. I look more closely. I look really, really closely. I anxiously await for trees and shrubs to flower, not just the garden flowers. I share my photos and the finds that I have because I want people to know that with just a little bit of help, we can all directly and immediately support wildlife populations and diversity. Anyone can start on a small garden scale in our own yards, or if you don't have a yard, support local organizations that are preserving and restoring native habitat. All of those places need sets of hands in order to help out. Last slide. Before we go to questions, I can almost guarantee that someone's wondering why I've done a presentation on pollinators and I haven't shown any honeybees. So while honeybees are definitely the most important agricultural pollinator to our economy, they're not native and they did not co-evolve as part of our natural ecosystem. So in reality, honeybees are an agricultural farm animal. However, everything that I've described about our restoration benefits them too. So this is a honeybee in a red bud blossom on our property. And I can almost guarantee that it really was supposed to be working on our neighbor's orchard instead of visiting us while it was there. My contact information, if you're interested, I do post 4 times a week on Instagram at Karen in Nature. So I try to really show insect plant combinations and include some basic information about the plants and the insects, or just some neat little tidbits about any of them. So if you're interested and you're on Instagram, please check me out there. I have a website, focusonnatives.com, where I've got quite a few of my photos. I was doing a better job of blogging. I haven't done one lately, but I'll be putting more posts up there. My blogs are primarily half photos, half words. So hopefully you can pull something there. And I have my husband's contact information as well. Like I said, he's the primary doer and worker. So that's it. And I will hand it over to the moderators for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. That's wonderful. We have a bunch of questions on chat. Joe, are you able to see those?
Sure, I'll take the first one. Are there any non-native plants that can be more beneficial to the local ecosystem or a good complement to the native plants?
There certainly are some that can be beneficial that I would not pull out of my yard, but I wouldn't necessarily plant them to be part of the overall system. So for example, violets, and there are many different violets that show up in our yard, and some are native and some aren't. There are species of insects that will use some violets without knowledge of whether or not there are natives or not. I am far from having a pure native plant habitat. We have non-native plants in some of our gardens. The most important thing is, if you're going to plant non-natives, I'd highly suggest that you make sure that it isn't on anybody's invasive plant list. Pennsylvania state does not have a very extensive native plant list of what's invasives. So do a little Googling beyond just what's provided for the state of Pennsylvania in order to figure out what to stay away from.
And we have another question. What did you use to kill the weeds?
Perseverance. You mean the actual
I guess
chemicals?
correct. Correct.
That's a better question for my husband. I mean, we do use Roundup. I've got Roundup in my little drip bottle that I use when I do cut and paint. I know that there are a couple of herbicides that he uses that are more specific to some of the woody plants. So, you know, the bittersweet, the honeysuckle, those get a woody specific herbicide.
And at the beginning, how did you kill the noxious weeds when you started out?
We hired someone to come in to do that. And so portions of our meadow actually got sprayed with a chemical, and I can't tell you, it was probably a couple of them. He looked to see specifically what the problems were. And then I believe that there was a spray that ended up taking, it was done, I think, more than once. So there was one application. You give plants a chance to regrow because there's a lot of seed. You know, you want to see what's going to regerminate. And so the actual killing took place over that entire first year that we were living there. We moved in March and we planted the meadow, I think, in October. So there were several applications of that. And so remember, this is a property that was a cornfield since we don't know how long, but I've looked at the aerials that go back to the 30s, and it was an agricultural field in the 30s. So anything that we did to try to kill a few weeds was minor in comparison to what most likely had been applied to this property over all of the years as it was in production.
Okay.
So yeah, it was hard for me because I really thought that I was going to be coming in and doing this all without chemicals. But even with that, we had parts of the meadow that we had to redo because there were so many weeds that what we planted was not able to establish.
And go ahead, Chuck.
So I have a question. First of all, organizers, I can't see the chat, so I can't help with the Q&A from others, but I have my own question, which is,
Okay.
How hard was it to find a water source for the pond, and what was it? Is it a natural spring or?
It's our well pump.
Oh.
So the pond itself is a rubber lined, it's dug and it has a rubber liner over it that basically holds the water in place.
And you replace
And-
just from evaporation, you just replace it with the well water?
Correct.
And temperature's
So-
not a problem?
Nope. No, it's not. Now we're on a north facing slope. So, so most of our property, you know, it's the pond itself is not in the sun a lot, but it's constantly circulating too. Let me go back and show you the pond. Let's see. Meadow and so this around the edges is the rubber. So all the way up and over here is essentially where the pump is. And then there's a line that goes all the way up here along the side and spills out at the top. It's a biofalls. It's got filtration systems in it. And then we've got multiple waterfalls here that it comes down through back into this area. So cut rocks around all of the edges. We rocked the bottom originally. We ended up removing a lot of the rocks in the bottom later on. And this area over here is actually a bog garden. We had a friend who was doing work at the time, and they had a very wet property, and they had extra soil. So we ended up taking their soil to become our bog. The bog itself is also lined, and then we put holes through the the area that connects the bog garden and the pond so that it would help keep the bog remain wet.
So natural evaporation is at the same rate as the water feed to the pond?
It's an automatic feed, so it just comes on when it needs to.
So it has a level indicator? Oh, okay.
Yeah, right in the pump box itself.
Okay.
Yes, and when it starts running a lot, that's when we found once before that we had a leak. After so many years, actually we had it under reconstruction last year. We had a leak right at the upper biofalls, just right where that where the line that goes from the bottom connects up to the top. So it just needed to be resealed, but it was a big excavation project to get to it and find it in the first place, actually.
Are there other questions, Joe? Because I have another one if there aren't.
I'll ask one other one. It's a two-part question. What would be a realistic pollinator haven strategy for a very small, say an 1/8 of an acre urban property?
Well, the best way to start is to remove any lawn that isn't absolutely necessary. And I would say, on an 1/8 of an acre, you're not going to have room to put in a lot of trees. Hopefully you've got borrowed space from neighboring properties. And I think that's where I'd start. I'd look to see what's there. What do neighboring properties have from the standpoint of what's blooming and when? Because you may not be able to get like something blooming at all periods of time on your own property. So don't worry about that, but try to fill in the spaces when there isn't something else in the area, and work on replacing those plants that aren't providing any support. So if you've got if you've got yews or other non-native foundation plants, those can be replaced with something like a winterberry holly or other types of shrubs that provide pollination capabilities. And work on pulling in a few of those plants that just have massive appeal, like I showed earlier that we have with the mountain mint.
And I think he answered, at least in part, the second part of the question, which is, should I focus on specific species or are there other options?
Well, if you have a really small area and you've only got an opportunity to pull in a few plants, go on ahead and pull in some that are going to be broad attractors. A lot of people say they want to plant cardinal flower or, like the cardinal flower because they want hummingbirds, but that's about all that comes. It's not like you're going to get massive amount of pollinators that come to a cardinal flower, where if instead you plant some of these other plants, you're going to get a much broader array. But while you're doing that, also make sure you put in a few plants that will help support the some of the larvae. So I think it's fun to kind of figure out what's a plant for a type of insect or pollinator that you really care about, and go on ahead and put in one of those associated plants, add a few to try to attract them to your yard.
Karen, if you don't have any green thumbs, where are the sources to start this process to answer those questions that you just posed?
Well, the most beautiful thing about native planting is you don't need to have a green thumb. In fact, it's most perfect if you don't, because the only thing that you really need to make sure is that you're putting in the right plant for what would normally be native in your area for your particular space. Because it doesn't matter if you don't prepare the soil or anything. I mean, one of the things that I didn't talk about with our garden areas was this isn't like planting a garden where you're bringing in tons of topsoil and you're adding all sorts of preparation. We just took the way it had been plowed and put these plants right in the ground. No special anything with them. So there are many online resources that you can use to try to, get you to what are native plants in your area. There are some people that, places that specialize in native plants. So Edge of the Woods in the Lehigh Valley would be one of those places that you could go to where you could get some help. And there are native plant groups on Facebook that help people out with that.
Thank you.
Places to look.
Thank you.
What kind of mountain mint do you recommend?
We have two different types in ours. They're both, their name is pycnanthemum, and I couldn't tell you what it is beyond that. Again, look up pycnanthemum and what's native in Pennsylvania, and you can go with either of those.
What do you use to hold back the grapevine and poison ivy?
I stay away from poison ivy because it doesn't agree with me. That is definitely Gary's job. So a lot of that is the cut and paint and the drip methods that we talked about. Gary will rip some of the plants out. So in our meadow, grape is pretty pervasive, but often it's coming from a few central locations that just regrow year after year after year. So after a while, he pretty much knows where the center is to go back to, does another cut and paint. And then once you cut all the pieces off, the rest of them, they kind of die. When they're going up your trees, you basically cut through them at the base. So like, for example, our poison ivies that had major vines that were going up the trees, he sawed out sections of them near the bottom of the tree and just let them die up in the tree. Some plants have different times of the year that they are more likely to succumb to chemical treatment. So poison ivy is one of those that when it's growing in the spring, it's very vibrantly pushing all of its energy out into the leaves. What you want with an herbicide is you want the plant to actually be sucking energy from the leaves back into the plant. So one of the periods that's best for killing poison ivy is about the time right before it starts to change color, because that's one of the periods when it is most rapidly bringing that energy back into the main plant. So when you apply the chemical right to the leaves at that point in time, you're much more likely to kill it or at least give it a major hurting. And different plants have different times that they're most effective for.
Joe, did you have some more questions?
Oh, yes. Let's see. On that picture of the spider's web, do you know what spider that was that made that web?
I do not. We have, so what I do know is that it was an orb weaver, because that's the family of spiders that actually do spin webs. And we do have several species of spiders around our house that they're the Neosconas, I think. They get relatively big and can do big nests like that. And something that I didn't realize is that they mostly build an entirely new web every single night. And most of the hunting's in the night, and during the day it decays. The next night they just go and do another one. And just kind of like by dumb luck, we had a dew in the air that morning, and I happened to look out and find it.
Comment that this is a wonderful story. did you just wait for the plants in the pond to escape all of the pots, or did you cut them out at some point?
We finally decided to try to remove all the plastic that was in the pond. But no, they pretty much went on their own. There were 3 different species of water lilies that we planted initially. One of them didn't survive. The other 2 still continue to survive. They were the main plants that pushed out, that and pickerel weed. One of the lovely surprises that we had was we bought 3 of these, I can't even see them in this photo, a plant called Golden Club, which is a very uncommon plant here in Pennsylvania. And so we bought 3 species of them, hoping they would do well, and they've just completely naturalized over the whole pond. In fact, that's these things right here. It's a very ancient plant, and that's actually the flower. It's just a single spike that comes up. So that started as 3 tiny little pots, and all of those flowers now are dozens of plants that just completely, seeded around the pond.
And where do you get your the restoration plugs?
That my husband got those as part of his trade and business. At this point, I'm not sure what company it was. I guarantee it came from multiple companies. And we did this 20 years ago. There are many more companies in the business with native plants now than there were, 20 years ago, which is a really good thing.
Praying mantids have been found to help control spotted lanternflies. I think they should be allowed to remain, was the comment.
Yeah, I know a lot about spotted lanternflies. So praying mantids are what you call an indiscriminate predator. They will eat anything and everything that's around. And I also have taken photos of them eating spotted lanternflies on my property. The number of spotted lanternflies that they eat compared to everything else is minuscule, and it isn't relevant to even any of the size of the lanternflies that have been in our property. I would actually argue that our native spiders are far better at controlling the populations for 2 reasons. One is that the lanternflies get caught in their webs, and whether or not the spider has any interest in eating them, the lanternflies are just really dumb and can't figure out mostly how to get out of them. So they get stuck and they end up dying. So on my property, and I have to tell you that over these years now with the spotted lanternflies, we had a major problem with large numbers of mantids, and they took out very few of the spotted lanternflies compared to our spiders.
And why do you
keep going with the natives?
Okay.
Let's try to keep those non-natives not around. Killing one non-native with another non-native is part of what has gotten our ecosystem into a lot of trouble over the years.
And why do you mow the meadow each year?
Because we live in the land of deciduous woodlands. Pennsylvania was Penn's Woods. If we did not mow it, our meadow would essentially end up reverting over completely to woodlands. So it's a conscious choice that we make, that we want to maintain meadow. I showed the area where we've stopped mowing. That's essentially what happens. It's going to grow up in trees.
Getting back to native and non-native, are there any non-native plants that can be more beneficial to the local ecosystem or a good complement to the native plants?
Yeah, I think we might have touched on that one a little bit earlier. I don't know how any of them could be more, because, there are certainly, let's just take as an example, nectaring plants. there are plenty of plants out there that our insects will nectar on. But most of those don't also serve as sources for insect larvae to live on. And so really, we're much better off if we plant the plants that can do double duty, because they have completely evolved with the plants that are in this ecosystem. And, you know, I've had people tell me before that, so butterfly bush is one of those that, you know, a lot of people really love because it is a large attractor for butterflies. And the problem with that is that it has become an invasive plant across much of our landscape. And people will tell me, well, but I've never seen another, you know, butterfly bush in my property, so it's obviously not escaping. And that's probably because the property just isn't amenable to that plant. It's going to be, those seeds are being carried off their property and they're regenerating in other places. So, you know, it's hard. And quite honestly, there's so little known about so many of our native insects, and for that matter, even some of our native plants. And so then when you get into what's the interaction in the relationship of the two, there's so much room for anybody who wants to become a scientist to just like make massive discoveries in their own backyard, because I'm regularly researching, you know, different insects and what I'm seeing, and the answer always comes back, you know, not always, but often we don't know.
Here's one. I've been using USDA plant site to find out what is native to our county. How local is a plant to be native? Because when you go to the nursery, they call anything in northeastern US native or in North America.
Okay, we could have an entire presentation on that question. Because then you get into the whole question of not just is it the native plant, but was it a native ecotype? Because it might be a native plant, but was it a plant that actually was grown in and as part of a seed that was grown in the area? You know, I'm not a purist when it comes to even putting native plants on our property that were only ever considered a native plant, because some of the question is, when was that from? You know, some of this goes back to, you know, before Europeans arrived. And, you know, there's sort of a declaration that that was the period of time. Not that they even completely know what plants were around, but many of the more meadowy plants were definitely not on the East Coast again, because we were woodlands, right? And so we have a very different habitat now. And so I think the bigger question comes down to, have the insects that are important as pollinators and need to be able to use it for a sustainable landscape, are they here, and is that important? And then I'll add one more piece to that. As we have global climate change, we've certainly been adding plants that previously had native ranges that were somewhat south of us, but these are plants now. I mean, I have already been witnessing over, you know, the time on our property, some of the species of insects that migrate every year that are starting to become local breeders, because they're now able to live through our winters. And so why shouldn't we be making sure that we've got the plants here also to be able to help and support them? Because the plants aren't going to move fast enough to be able to keep up with climate change. So, you know, there's lots of different arguments for different things. I think most important is what you can find, put it on your property, and do something that's even a native, whether it's Pennsylvania or Delaware, and it's way better than a non-native plant that you may be taking the place of, especially if it's a lawn.
Okay, we'll wrap up on some real practical questions.
Okay.
Just a couple of them that are kind of related to one another. When you mow the meadow, do you leave all the cuttings in place?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. And so that's even true in our planting beds. And so I showed you the one of our front bed. That's essentially from weed whacking any of the stems of things that were up. Those stems may have, the bee eggs for the year. So those remain in place.
Okay. And what is your timing for the meadow mowing?
Meadow mowing depends somewhat on how well when the last snow melts. But in general, we try to get it. It's usually around the beginning of April, but there has been once when we didn't get until the beginning of May. And so if we end up getting it a little bit later, we might end up cutting back a few of the perennials that had already started to come up, but that doesn't kill them. It's gonna just stunt them a little bit, which actually is better for me because then the meadow's a little shorter, and some years it's so tall I can't even take photos of insects on the top of the flowers because they're over my head.
Well, Karen, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation, and we're really pleased that you could come and present it.
Good. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And we'll be posting the presentation in the next few days. So be patient. Just go to the MAREA website and you'll find it. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone next month, the last Tuesday of the month, for Talk on Wind. So been a pleasure for us to host everyone tonight, and hope everyone has a great evening. And again, thank you so much, Karen.
You're welcome. The plant everyone's seeing right now is one called mountain mint. And it's actually one of the plants that has very broad appeal to a lot of different types of pollinators. And this is our meadow.
When was this video taken?
This was last summer, probably August.
Pretty.
Those are silver spotted skippers. That's the hummingbird clearwing moth.
Oh, wow.
Many people mistake it for a hummingbird because the way it hovers while it feeds. It's actually pretty big.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I've seen those. They're really cool.
Yes, they are.
As big as a cicada.
A little bit bigger, I think. Yeah, about that size. There's a couple other that look similar to it. One that's a little smaller that's really the same size as bumblebees. And that's a butterfly called a hair streak. And they rub their tail pieces together in order to try to disguise their rear end as being eyes. And it isn't uncommon to find that rear part being eaten. Predators actually think that they've gobbled them, and instead they get away. The main flower here is Monarda, also known as bee balm. This is a plant called Joe Pie weed. A lot of our native plants, they actually have the word weed in them.
Presentation.
You're Jonathan, Drew, and Michael Scott.
That's right. All three.
And this is goat's beard. They tend to attract much smaller pollinators. These are longhorn flower beetles.
I know what that is.
It's a bee. You know what kind of bee?
No, I just know that I'm allergic to them.
So that's a megachile. It's got brushes underneath its abdomen. You can see how it's all yellow underneath. That tells you that it's in that family of bees.
So here's a question, Karen. Do all bees have stingers?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, but what you're looking at right now, that last one was not a bee, it was a fly, and it doesn't have any stingers at all. But most bees will only use their stingers in defense if they absolutely have to. It is more of the wasps, and specifically the yellow jackets, that tend to be the ones that sting people. But people really don't do very well with differentiating between a bee and a wasp.